Floss presents the complete and alarming history of America's greatest garage band, the Stools.
I think it was Elvis Costello who said, you spend your whole life writing your first album and then 6 months writing your second.
I'm not sure what it is you think you thought.
The second album is really the test, isn't it?
Sophomore Slump is a truly great double album. It's like listening to a really cool college radio station.
When I'm drunk, is any of my business.
It's funny that most bands suffer a sophomore slump for their second album, and yet the Stools called their brilliant second album just that, Sophomore Slump.
In January of 1957, Antonio Moretti's old drinking buddy Bill Haley invited the Stools to join Bill Haley and his Comets on a tour of Australia. But the Stools' management turned him down.
Well, they got pictures of koala bears and little dingoes on their money, don't they? How can you take a country like that seriously?
Well, the 1957 Australia tour opened up because Frank Sinatra was supposed to do a tour, and he got in a snit with one of the airlines because he booked 2 berths for the flight down under. Back then you could book berths on a plane like you could on a train. When he got to the airport, he wanted a 3rd berth, but they were all sold out and they couldn't give it to him, so he canceled the whole tour. It cost the promoter Lee Gordon something like $200,000 just at the Sydney Stadium alone. So both he and Australian music fans were pretty hungry for American music by the time the Comets came to town.
Bill Haley, breaking all kinds of records down under, playing in New South Wales to 7,000 people 2 nights in a row. During that 3-week tour, they played to crowds of over 300,000 people.
So when Haley makes the same offer to Antonio again to join the Comets on their tour of the UK, they meet up in New York, board the Queen Elizabeth, and set sail for jolly old England.
The ship is met in Southampton by 4,000 screaming fans, and there are even more when they get off the train in London. The Comets have just arrived, and they're the first real rock and roll band to ever tour England.
The Stools are kind of pushed aside at this point, which couldn't have sat very well with them.
At the time, a young Scotsman named Lonnie Donegan was tearing up the town with his skiffle music.
Skiffle was sort of a bastardized version of New Orleans jazz, with jugs, washboards, and cheap plastic Spanish guitars.
Al Floss, the Stools' manager, saw that Lonnie Donegan was sitting at the top of the UK charts by covering Leadbelly's Rock Island Line, and figured it would be the next big craze to hit the United States. So he told the Stools to drop everything and become a skiffle group. And they did.
One squirt don't hurt. You gotta do it every day. You can't get pregnant that way. That's an old wives' tale. Would I lead you astray? One squirt won't hurt. What do you say? I know you're new to town. Let me help you off the turn-up truck. Aren't you the daughter of Farmer Brown? Sitting down. One squirt don't hurt. You gotta do it every day. You can't get pregnant that way. That's an old wives' tale. Would I lead you astray? One squirt don't hurt. What do you say?
By the late 50s, there were over 40,000 skiffle groups in Britain.
Rock icons like the Beatles, Mick Jagger, and even the Bee Gees all got their starts in skiffle groups.
Van Morrison, Jimmy Page, Ritchie Blackmore, they all started off as skiffle groups. Ronnie Wood,
Graham Nash, David Gilmour.
Howsomever, much like the monarchy, skiffle never really took off in the United States. And the Stools would have to change direction once again.
I think, if we're being honest, Al Floss really didn't see much potential in skiffle music. To save on freight, he had the band board the Queen Elizabeth and not bring their instruments or amps, figuring it would be cheaper to just rent equipment when they got there. But then when he got to England, he heard skiffle music being played on bargain basement instruments like a tea chest converted to a bass, a cigar box guitar. And then he said, boys, you're now a skiffle group.
Well, in all fairness to Al Floss, I don't even think American electric guitars would work over there with the difference in a currency and all. So why would you even bother bringing them over there?
They were a great skiffle band as far as skiffle bands go, which isn't very far.
Well, of course there was skiffle, but at this time Harry Belafonte was running up the charts with his calypso music, so the Stools figured they'd try folk music too.
Molly McButter was a good friend of mine. The people around her were cruel and unkind. They called her Crisco 'cause she was fat in the can. Molly McButter, she had a plan. Molly was a lifeguard, ironic, I know. How many times did they cry, there she blow? But she turned a deaf swimmer's ear to their mean jive.
In '57, folk music hadn't fully taken off yet, but the Stools gave it a go, and there are other groups too, like the Terriers and the Easy Riders.
The Easy Riders were part of Mitch Miller's plot to derail rock and roll. They didn't do much. I think one of their songs became the anthem for Hungarian refugee revolt, but hey, that's what good folk singers are supposed to do, right?
Terry Gilkyson was in the Easy Riders, and he also wrote the Bare Necessities song for the Jungle Book years later, but that was about it. His son, Tony, was in Lone Justice and X, the LA punk band. I remember the Easy Riders almost had a hit with the song Tell the Captain, which the Beach Boys later had a much bigger hit with as Sloop John B.
Ah, the Terriers. Now that was a band. Cindy O' Cindy, Deo.
The Terriers were your typical folk band out of the Washington Square scene in New York. Only Alan Arkin was in the band. But he quit after a year to do the acting thing. The band limped on for a few years before the British invasion put them out of their misery.
This might be a good time to address the elephant in the room, as it were. Why are there so few pictures of the Stools in the 50s? And actually, there were tons of them. But Al Floss went to great lengths to retrieve most of them. Of course, today with your internet, you can find them anywhere, if you know where to look.
Why did Al Floss embargo all the early pictures and film of the Stools? Well, it's complicated.
Bill Haley effectively killed his own career by going to England. The kids snapped up every ticket to all of his concerts. But then they actually got to see Bill Haley. Well, end of story.
Haley was not a pretty man. He was a little rotund, in his 30s, balding. He was not the rebellious rock and roller that kids were looking for. Yeah, he looked like their father. And soon, boom, career over.
When Elvin Anderson got out of the hospital after the RC Cola truck incident, he looked like he had aged 30 years, walked with a pronounced limp, and put on a ton of weight. Now, Gene Vincent, he walked with a limp. And Fats Domino, he was fat, and Harry Belafonte was no spring chicken. But when you put them all together, it doesn't do much for the teen audience.
Al Floss learned a lesson from Bill Haley and did everything he could to keep the kids from seeing Elvin Anderson. A wise move.
Well, it built a little mystery around him. He wasn't that repulsive, on the whole, once you got to know him.
This would be one of the reasons that Elvin stopped touring. He just stayed in the studio. If they did play live, it was a very controlled circumstance.
You always hear about contract riders where bands say, no green M&Ms, or only this kind of spring water, or no turkey loaf. Well, the Stools started that.
Antonio Moretti wanted a box of Wheaties backstage at every show, but being a Celtics fan, he only wanted ones with Bob Cousy on the box. They walked out of a show in Brooklyn once because all they had backstage there was a Duke Snider box. Stupid Dodgers fans.
In November of 1956, the Stools and their Wheaties had been on the bill at the Forum, along with a bunch of other acts like Bill Haley and the Comets, Frankie Lyman, the Platters, Chuck Berry. Berry tells the Stools about the Irving Fled The Greatest Show of 1957 he's going to tour with in February, and thinks the band should join too. Elvin's old friend Laverne Baker is on the bill along with Chuck, Fats Domino, Clyde McButter, and several other acts. And if Irving Fled knew one thing, it was how to make money with these tours. The only problem is, because most of the other acts are black or unknown, like Buddy Holly and the Crickets, they'll be playing for 80 straight days and nights.
Fled might have known how to make money, but he didn't know how to book a tour. For instance, the tour played Akron, Ohio on September 10th, then headed southwest to Cincinnati on the 11th, and then doubled back to Columbus in central Ohio the next day.
All of the acts were crammed into 2 buses, and sometimes things would happen, like one time traveling between Atlanta and New Orleans, and the cops pulled them over, and the cops told them they had to segregate into 2 buses. They had to have all the blacks in one bus and all the whites in the other bus, and also the black acts and the white acts weren't allowed to share the same stage in places like Chattanooga and Birmingham and Atlanta.
The nice thing about the tour was that it included the Northern Rocky Mountain states, which had never seen a live rock and roll tour before.
To pass the time on the buses, they usually played craps, the dice game. And I understand that Chuck Berry won a lot of money off the other performers, mostly Buddy Holly from what I hear. And so he was able to afford to buy a Cadillac and be driven to the shows rather than sit on the bus. Cosmo Ditmar, I understand, actually drove a lot with him.
Cosmo had a great relationship with Chuck Berry that went all the way back to 1955. Cosmo was at VJ Records, and Chuck was right across the street at Chess Records. Muddy Waters had brought him in, and Berry played an old fiddle tune on a guitar, Ida Red. Chess Brothers were impressed.
The only problem was, Ida Red was a song in the public domain, so they couldn't make any publishing money off of it.
Apparently the Chess Brothers told Berry to change the lyric to make it about a car, find a new girl's name, and they'd record him.
A lot of the time, a lot of the Chicago blues performers were wearing eyeliner when they performed live to give them fuller eyelashes. Muddy, Wolf, Willie Dixon, they all used eyeliner, but they used it a combination of Vaseline and coal dust, which is not very safe. I understand that that's how Blind Blake went blind, which really worked out just as well for him because Arthur Blake really isn't much of a blues name. Blind Blake, that's the blues.
So they're hanging out at a bar, and Chuck Berry asked Cosmo Ditmar what kind of eyeliner he used. Cosmo said it was something he got from his mom. It had to be good because it had been tested on animals. It was called Maybelline.
A light bulb goes off in Chuck Berry's head, and soon Ida Red becomes Maybelline. So he offers half of the songwriting credits to Cosmo, but Cosmo says, give my songwriting credits to Russ Fratto. Fratto is a local leg breaker down on Chicago's South Side, and everyone, including Cosmo and Berry, owe money to, even Leonard Chess.
Now, fast forward to April of 1955, and Leonard Chess is throwing a bar mitzvah for his son, Marshall. And every R&B artist is there, every record company executive, every record company owner, every distributor, every A&R guy, and a lot of DJs, including Alan Freed, They managed to sober Freed up enough to get him to listen to Maybelline with Chuck Berry and Willie Dixon on bass, Jasper Thomas on drums, and Jerome Green on maracas, and Freed is knocked out. And soon that summer, a hit single is born.
In March, the Stools briefly jumped off the Greatest Show of 1957 tour to go back to New York and appear on Alan Freed's brand new TV show. But before they could get there, on Freed's second only show, Frankie Lyman was shown dancing with a white girl, and ABC pulled the plug on the whole thing, leaving the Stools stuck in New York with no gig.
Race mingling might have been the reason that ABC gave for kicking Freed off the air. But truth is, they were just looking for a reason. Freed's show debut was just a few weeks before they took Dick Clark's American Bandstand National, also on ABC. A House subcommittee on legislative oversight was being convened to help clean up the airwaves. And a race-baiting Jewish fella like Alan Freed was just what they were looking for.
Actually, according to halachic law, Alan Freed was not really an authentic Jew, but he had a swarthy appearance and a large nose, so it was good enough for their purposes.
And what ABC fired him for was refusing to sign a humiliating oath, admitting to practices that he had already admitted to the House committee that he had taken part in. So he was kind of damned if you do, damned if you don't. Of course, Dick Clark, ABC's other contract employee, was never asked to sign such an oath.
The skids were greased and American Bandstand took to the air as Alan Freed limped off into the sunset.
New York was always a good town for the Stools, no more so than in 1957 when the city was going through some changes and they were converting a lot of rooms from showrooms to music rooms where people would actually go and sit and listen to the show, watch the band. I think it speaks to the maturing taste of the city.
Well, there was also a cabaret tax at the time that tacked on an extra 20% to every tab in a club that had a dance floor. I think that killed the floor shows too.
In April of '57, Buddy Knox had the #1 hit with the rockabilly song Party Doll.
Now, Buddy Knox and his Texas rockabilly was nowhere near as rough as Memphis rockabilly. It was much more poppy. Just listen to the stuff Knox's bass player, Jimmy Bowen, put out with the very same band, very fey.
Unfortunately, Buddy Knox was also a lieutenant in the Army Reserve, and he got called up for 6 months of active duty.
The A&R team at Roulette Records, Hugo Peretti and Luigi Creatori, go into a panic. They rush Knox into the studio to record a quick 20 songs so that his career doesn't dry up while he's in uniform. But it does anyway. I mean, he almost has a hit with a 1911 novelty song called Hula Love, but that's only because Dick Clark put in his movie Jamboree.
So Buddy Knox's backing band, the Rhythm Orchids, are really just a bunch of his college buddies from Texas. And Hugo and Luigi want to cover all their bases while Knox is in the tank corps. So they bring the Stools in to knock out about 20 tracks because they know the Stools work fast and cheap. So fast, in fact, that they used the leftover recording time to record their own song, Jabberjaw.
Jabberjaws, 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 Jabberjaws. Couldn't keep quiet about what you saw, Jabberjaw. Pulled up to a traffic light, you were looking like trouble. My old cow died last night, so I don't need your ball. You'll be the one if you corral that tongue, let's go. Jabberjaws, 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 Jabberjaws. You'll be the one if you corral that tongue, Jabberjaw. Heading out too late where the cats are parking. Your favorite food is wedding cake. You couldn't help remarking. You didn't say a thing about a wedding ring. Now you're talking. Jabberjaw, 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 Jabberjaw. You didn't say a thing about a wedding ring. Jabberjaw. Hey! Jaws. Jabba Jaws. Couldn't keep quiet about what you saw. Jabba Jaws. We was doing 90, hadn't left third gear. On the double, there's trouble bubble in the rearview mirror. About to get popped by the cop, stay there and zip it. Jabba Jaws. Jabba Jaws. Jabba Jaws. Jabba Jaws. About to get popped by the cops. Jabba Jaws.
Legend has it that Paul Anka was coming into the studio that day to record the song Diana. Well, he showed up early and he laid down some backing vocals on the track. He was then credited on the record sleeve as Montezuma for legal reasons.
The West Coast had the Wrecking Crew, Detroit had the Funk Brothers, Muscle Shoals had the Swampers, as the song says. Meanwhile, the Stools were up in Boston. In addition to Elvin, Antonio, and Cosmo, you had all these great players coming through over the years. Bolt Upright, Paisley Owsley, Crunch Hardtack.
At one point, Sit Down, Pat Fanny, and Gail Warnings were all in the band.
Alice Lost, Jenny Side, Baxter Nature.
Dawson D. Towell, Tab Collar, Joy Anna Delight.
Mark Card, Sam Pelkes, Hollyhocks. It was a revolving door of East Coast talent.
And the Stools would keep revolving, much like their second long-playing album, the double-disc Sophomore Slump, which we will examine in depth next time on the complete and alarming history of America's greatest garage band, the Stools. Join us then, won't you?
The Tools cut. Oh my. The Stools.